We're in a pretty obscure passage here, kind of. It's going to be interesting when we get done, whether you think, hopefully you will understand why this passage was put in here. But that's my question to start out with. Genesis 34, this is part 3, lesson 8 on Dinah. Remember the story of Dinah? The only daughter that we know for sure of Jacob. And it's just this obscure story. What's the big deal with her? What's she up to? What do you remember about that story?
It's a sordid thing.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. Kind of like Judah and Tamar. It seems like out in the middle of nowhere it pops up, and and here we have it too. Remember what Simeon and Levi did? They went in and killed them all. Yep. Why did they do it? Do you remember?
To avenge their sister.
To avenge their sister. To avenge Dinah. Yes. Okay. Where was Jacob in all of this?
He just wasn't there.
He wasn't, was he?
Those kids didn't tell him anything, did they?
He said a few words before, or it says that he waited for the sons to come home, right? Mm-hmm. And then later it just says that he kind of yelled at them for, now we're a stench in the nostrils of the people here. Right. So that's about all we hear from him. I think those are connected. I think that's the purpose of this passage. Why do you think this was put in Scripture, this weird passage? Why do you think it was put in there?
I was telling Court, with our background, we think it's because God wanted his people separate from the others, and this was to show what happens if you don't keep yourselves to yourself and let yourself mix with other people who have other gods. But I told him he'll probably have something way different. He'll probably mess with that.
Well, that and the failure to follow God's orders.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that.
When he moved into that neighborhood and bought that piece of property, he was told to clean house. He didn't do it.
That's right.
Well, he wasn't told then to kill all the inhabitants, was he?
No. Not yet.
Not yet, no.
Now, that's a Moses time
frame,
but picture this again is Moses telling the story, right?
That's right. That's right.
So it always kind of changes things when you put it in the perspective of the children of Israel being the ones hearing this, or that this story is actually aimed at and targeted at. So it always changes the perspective. All right, let's get into it. I think we got a few people come on in, so I think we do. Anyway, more visitors. Maybe they won't. All right, but before we get started, I didn't cover that in the first part of the second part of Abraham. I never covered the part of circumcision. So we're going to do a little talk about circumcision this morning. Sorry, ahead of time. All right, because it does play a very important part in the Bible, and you have to understand what circumcision is and what it's all about in order to understand this passage and many other passages as well. I mean, even into the New Testament, you hear a lot about circumcision and the battle between Paul and the Jews, whether they have to be circumcised or not. All of that is still important, even in the New Testament. So grab a piece of paper there and have a seat. In perfect timing. We're just getting into the text.
I think we're a little late, but what's your name?
That's okay.
Hi. Oops, these are...
A couple of them on wheels there, so. All right. Yeah, now I put the table in between us and you guys still sit further back all the time, so. All right. We are on page 78, so just flip the page once over and we're going to talk about circumcision. Good morning. It's a good topic for Sunday morning, don't you think? Page 78 there. The oldest documented evidence of circumcision was in ancient Egypt. Okay? Now you can tell I'm kind of hooked on Egypt. All of my stuff right here and up there. And So it's not, I'm just not saying it because I'm a fan of ancient Egypt, but the earliest evidence, all the way back to the 6th dynasty, 2300 to 2100 BC, they are bas relief, which are carvings into the stone in Saqqara. The inscriptions read, "The ointment is to make it acceptable, and hold him so that he does not fall." Kind of interesting comments about how to do circumcision. The oldest written account about an Egyptian named, that's supposed to be named, Uha, who boasted of his ability to endure the pain. All right, he boasted. Herodotus in the 5th century wrote that the Egyptians practiced circumcision for the sake of cleanliness, considering it better to be cleanly than comely. Is his. Everybody know of Herodotus? One of the first probably historians, the official type of historian. Other sources considered circumcision as to mark a rite of passage, where this ritual gave you access to ancient mysteries reserved for the initiated. Circumcision was practiced for this purpose in the rest of Africa as a rite of passage for new hunters or new shamans. In the Book of the Dead, the sun god Ra cut himself to make 2 major spiritual protection deities. The priests performed the act in a public ceremony and was usually reserved for the upper class, as the slaves and the Egyptian workers were usually not depicted as circumcised. Some of the Semites, of which Jacob was a part, practiced circumcision, especially those in contact with Egypt. The Colchians, the Ethiopians, Phoenicians, Syrians. When Alexander the Great took over the known world, he despised the practice, and so it was stopped or severely curtailed in the areas with Greek influence ever since then. So that's the archaeological background for it, okay? But now let's get into biblical circumcision. The actual picture I have there comes out of a tomb. I've seen that, taken a picture of that on a tomb in Saqqara. This is something that was put on a papyrus. It's the relief that somebody painted on a papyrus, but that scene is in the temple there in Saqqara, which when you go to Egypt with me, all of you, you'll be able to see that bas relief in the temple in Saqqara. All right, page 79, biblical circumcision. Genesis 17, circumcision was instituted by God to seal the covenant with Abraham. After God appeared in a dream to renew the covenant and then said, "You are to undergo circumcision, and it will be a sign of the covenant between me and you." Exodus 4, that strange passage where God was to kill Moses and Zipporah circumcised their son to prevent it. Exodus 12, any foreigner who wants to fully participate in the Lord's Passover and full communion with the Israelites must be circumcised. Joshua 5, all Israel was circumcised, the new generation, as they entered the promised land. In Ezekiel 44, no uncircumcised can enter the temple, verse 9. Later passages, circumcision, or the lack of it, was considered a euphemism for being unclean and unholy. Moses considered himself a man of uncircumcised lips, unclean, unholy. That's how it's normally translated. I am a man of unclean lips. Leviticus 19, the land is uncircumcised, belongs to the Canaanites. It is unclean and holy. Jeremiah 6:10, has ears that are uncircumcised. God's words are offensive to them. Also, passages calling circumcision the outward sign of something supposed to happen on the inside. Deuteronomy 30, the Lord your God will circumcise your hearts and the hearts of your descendants, so that you may love him with all your heart and with all your soul and live. Jeremiah 9:25, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will punish all who are circumcised only in the flesh. And then in the New Testament, especially with Paul, it became abused into an unnecessary and even arrogant and prideful outward sign, so they could ignore the inward change that was necessary. Philippians, watch out for those dogs, says Paul, those evildoers, those mutilators of the flesh, for it is we who are the circumcision, who serve God by his Spirit, who boast in Christ, who put no confidence in the flesh, though I myself have reasons for such confidence. And in Galatians, are you so foolish? After beginning by means of the Spirit, are you now trying to finish by means of the flesh? As Paul was separating that spiritual circumcision from the physical, that it's no longer necessary to be circumcised. Okay? Your hearts need to be circumcised, not your flesh. All right, let's get into the passage. Genesis 34. I'm sure all of you have read it. Right?
One time or
Sometime or another.
The story of Dinah. We were talking before some of you came in on how obscure this passage is. It seems like right in the middle we have Jacob and Esau meeting each other, and Esau takes off, and Jacob is alone and settles there, and then all of a sudden this crazy story of Dinah, right in the middle of the Jacob narrative. Well, maybe it's not so crazy to be right where it is. Page 80, that painting there I thought was kind of unique. This is modern. I like to put older paintings in there too, but this is a modern painting done in 2011 by Ben Newman. Dinah. Dinah is the daughter of Leah and the full brother of Judah. That's it. Is the daughter of Leah and there's something wrong there. Sister of Judah, Simeon, Zebulun, Reuben, Levi, and Issachar, of the 12 sons of Jacob. Shechem, probably named after the city and not vice versa. Okay, the city they settled in was called Shechem, and here we find one of the sons of the head honcho of the city. His name was Shechem, so it was probably named after the city and not the city named after the man. Raped her, but fell in love with her. Hamor, Shechem's father, came to talk to Jacob and ask for Dinah for his son, telling Jacob that they would give him whatever he would ask as a bridal price. Jacob's sons and Dinah's brothers told them that they needed to be circumcised in order to allow Dinah to marry them, which they did. Simeon and Levi attacked them while they were still in pain and killed all of the males of the city. And then they took all of their flocks and herds along with everything else of value. Jacob is upset that his sons had poisoned their relationship with the locals, since they are few in number and it would not take much to destroy them. Okay, that's the general outline of the story, right? Now let's get into the literary nuances, and there are a lot. There are a lot of literary nuances to this story as we dig in behind the English and get into the Hebrew and the passages behind. Dinah went out to visit the women of the land, verse 1. This is a simple way to say a very complicated concept. Page 81 there. Fox says, went out to see the women of the land. Again, Fox translation. It's called the Shocking Bible, the 5 books of Moses. It's written in Hebrew form. It's in English, but it's in a form that keeps the poetry and keeps the, as much as possible, keeps the literal translation. Fox says, went out to see the women of the land. We will find the word see and its variations come up often and in complicated ways here in this passage. Visit implies going out for a cup of tea, right? She went out to visit the women of the land. It's like she went out to have a cup of tea with them. Well, that's not what it means. It's more likely investigate or get a sense of or spy on would be more accurate terms. Shechem saw, took, violated, verse 2. This is another example of a chain of uninterrupted verbs that convey a quick and often violent action to the hearers. This denotes an uncontrollable rape. Okay? Saw, again, we see that word see. She went out to see the land. He saw her. Okay, same word there. Took, violated. So again, picture yourselves, you're the Israelites in the desert, and you're hearing this. Okay, you're not reading this, you're hearing this, because it's an oral tradition. So Moses or your grandfather or whoever is telling the story, and you're hearing this, and you catch that Shechem saw, took, violated. And you even have that sense of immediacy, the sense of passionate, boom, this just happened. Saw, took, violated. Okay, this uncontrollable. So the words themselves and the collection of those verbs into one sentence. There's actually, there's 3 verbs here that the NIV translates, but the Hebrew actually has 4 verbs that right in a row, bam, 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 bam. Son of Hamor, verse 2. Interesting that the Hamor in Hebrew is a donkey. Hamor in Hebrew, that word Hamor in Hebrew is donkey. Could be an epithet, calling Shechem the son of a donkey. Or, in our modern idiom, a jack. You can finish the word. Okay? Son of a donkey. It could be that. We don't know for sure. It's just unusual for the king of a city to be named the Hebrew word for donkey. So there might be an epithet to fit in there as Moses was telling the story to them. All right? His heart was drawn to Dinah, verse 3. This complicates the morality tale, doesn't it? If it was a simple rape thing, you wouldn't have any problem with them coming in and exacting punishment on. But here he fell in love with this girl. A simple rape would demand repercussions that the hearers would have no problem with, but now his heart is tied up in her. The Hebrew here is nephesh, or life breath. His heart's life breath is with her. Okay? The life breath. Verse 4, get me this girl in the NIV translation. The demand to his father is the same verb used when he took Dinah. Take me this girl is what the Hebrew would be, the same word. A violent action. Get me this girl. Take me this girl. Okay? They were shocked and furious because Shechem had done an outrageous thing in Israel. Verse 7. This becomes, or has already become in Moses' time, a pun or an idiom. The phrase in Hebrew, Nevala be Yisrael, is repeated hundreds of times in Jewish literature and even a few more times in the Bible, meaning disgrace in Israel. Okay, they were shocked and furious because Shechem has done this disgrace in Israel. It also came to mean disgrace of Israel. And so the pun. Which one is it? Disgrace in Israel or disgrace of Israel? And this story is really both, isn't it? So you catch the double meaning of that idiom that was used. Disgrace in Israel or disgrace of Israel. This was a disgrace in Israel that became the disgrace of Israel. This also is proof that it was written after Moses' time, since the phrase could not have been used before the people occupied the land. The noun Israel is land or place, not person in this context. Okay, so it couldn't have been written before Moses, given that idiom. I will give you whatever you ask. Bride price, verse 11 and 12. The penalty for sleeping with a woman who are not betrothed to was steep. Not only were they required to marry the woman, but also pay a steep price to the father. Also, the word give has just as much emphasis as the word take or took earlier in the chapter. So you can see the passion of this kid. I call him a kid. At this point, we don't know how old he is. How old would you say Shechem is? We get the perspective of a 20-something. I'm thinking most of us have kind of that in the back of our minds. But he's this impulsive, I'll give you anything you want, right? And he took her and take her for me, Dad, and I'll give you anything you want. The word give has that same emphasis as the take does. Verse 13, Jacob's sons replied deceitfully. This is the exact same term as applied to Jacob, deceiving for the blessing, and used against Laban for switching the brides on Jacob. Seems to be an inherited tendency. This whole deceiving and deceitful thing. All right, flip the page, 82. You become like us, circumcising all, or we will take, there's that word again, take our sister and go. Verse 14 to 17. Many hearers would catch the offhanded humor here that the offending, in quotes, organ was to be cut, but also that they would take their sister and go. Again, that violent word take, just as you took our daughter, we're going to take her from you, or you took our sister, we're going to take you from her. The young man, verse 19, Hamor and Shechem, here we get our first indication of the age of Shechem. He was probably a teenager, as was Dinah. With the word used, same as a reference to Isaac in the Akedah. Abraham took the lad Isaac for sacrifice. So we have this picture of Isaac being really young, but he was probably a teenager. Okay, and it's the same with this. This is the same word used here, the lad, the young man. Okay, so he was probably a very impulsive, spoiled brat teenager. Live in our land and trade in it, verse 21. Hamor and Shechem changed the terms to convince the townspeople of the need for circumcision. They put it in economic terms, saying that they will increase in trade and sow wealth within the town. All you have to do is, these are very rich people and they want to trade with us, so we just have to be circumcised and you guys are going to be wealthy too. All the men who went out the city gate, verse 24. This is a military reference to all the fighting men of the city who went out the city gate to fight battles for the city. So you already get the indication that something's going to happen. All the fighting men are the ones going to be circumcised. To the sword, verse 26, literally to the mouth of the sword. And this is where we get the references to the sword consuming or the sword eating in biblical language. The sword consumes. Have you heard that phrase before? Or the sword eats, the sword consumes, the sword swallows. And took Dinah. There's that word again. Verse 26. Here's another instance of the violently took Dinah. It seems that Shechem and Hamor kept Dinah in their city, and she was unaware of the negotiations taking place on her behalf, nor the death that occurred because of it. The question is, was she there voluntarily or forced? That part we don't know about Dinah. The sons of Jacob came upon the dead, verse 27. It seems like the other sons did the plundering after Simeon and Levi killed. But the Hebrew could be read both ways. Verse 27 says, the sons of Jacob came upon. It could be referring just to those two, Simeon and Levi, but it just as easily could refer to all the other sons came upon the dead bodies and they plundered them. Okay, it could be looked at both ways. Page 83. Didn't know there was all this packed into this little passage, now did you? Where their sister had been defiled, verse 27, literally where they had took their sister, again that word again. Two things here, another instance of the violent took, but also notice the culpability. All of the men, because of the actions of their beloved leader, all the men were guilty now because of the actions of their leader. That's why the justification behind killing all the men of the city. And then verse 31, should he have treated our sister like a prostitute? Verse 31. The final words of the sons are telling, mainly because of the absence of response from Jacob. Notice, Jacob has no role here other than being upset by their actions and no answer to them when they challenge him. Young women were not in control of their own bodies. Their fathers were, or the patriarch of the family was. Laban had his two daughters. Remember, he was in control of the two daughters, not the daughters themselves. He controlled who they slept with, who they married, who they were servants to. When Jacob did not answer Shechem, when he violated the young girl in his responsibility, then the brothers took over, as was their right. Jacob didn't respond, so the sons responded. From this point on, Jacob is under control of his sons. This is a pivotal story included in this narrative because of the transition from Jacob being in control of his sons to the sons being in control. Next week he will move to Bethel, and that'll virtually be the last we hear of Jacob, other than in the side. He made a coat for his son Joseph, and he cries when Joseph is dead, and he moves to Egypt. But this is the last where Jacob is in charge. This is that transitional passage where Jacob loses his birthright, the one in charge. Okay, Jacob first made a mistake in settling there instead of Bethel, which God corrects in the next chapter. Okay, in the next chapter, God tells him move to Bethel. But from now on, it should be, but from now on, he is at the mercy of his sons, his actions, and even where to live becomes the son's responsibility. And it's Joseph that takes him down to Egypt. Okay? The story is mirrored in David's time, with his sons, and when we find David also powerless against his sons and leaders of the army. David does the same thing. He lets go of his patriarchal responsibility, his birthright. He lets it go for the sake of his children, when he shouldn't have, before he should have. Okay? So, for page 84. Jacob does respond, though, to his son's actions eventually in his deathbed blessing. Okay, this is from the end of Genesis, Genesis 49, verse 5 to 7. Genesis 50 is the last chapter of the Bible, or last chapter of Genesis. And right at the end, as Jacob dies, he gives his blessing to all his sons. Well, he doesn't quite bless Simeon and Levi. Simeon and Levi are brothers. Their swords are weapons of violence. Let me not enter their council. Let me not join their assembly. For they have killed men in their anger, and hamstrung oxen as they pleased. Cursed be their anger so fierce, and their fury so cruel. I will scatter them in Jacob, and disperse them in Israel. Simeon was eventually absorbed into Judah, and no longer its own tribe. Levi used their swords again to redeem themselves with Moses in the golden calf incident, and they became priests, but they were also scattered through the land with no land to call their own. Simeon and Levi. Now, how many of you have heard of the book of Jubilees? Have you heard of that? It's in the Apocrypha of the Roman Catholic Church, and some Protestant churches like the Ethiopian, well, they would be Protestant, I guess. So the Ethiopian Orthodox Church has Jubilees. It's also sometimes called the Lesser Genesis or the Leptogenesis. It has its own version of the Dinah story. I won't give you the whole thing, but it says that Dinah was 12 years old. It says nothing of the circumcision, just that Simeon and Levi dealt with them deceitfully, and then went in and slaughtered them in righteous judgment. And then it gives lessons. Jubilee does that, gives lessons. Lesson 1 is that outsiders beware, because the same will be visited on you if you defile any daughter of Israel. The same will be visited on you. Lesson 2, any Israelite giving his daughter to Gentiles will also be killed by stoning, and the daughter burned to rid, that's supposed to be, isn't that right? Burned to rid the nation of that dishonor. Burned to rid the nation of that dishonor. So what do you think? What's the lesson that we hear from the story of Dinah?
Don't dishonor the women.
Don't dishonor the women. message.
Don't mess with them, don't mess with the Israelites.
Don't mess with the Israelites. Okay. Does it make a difference knowing that Shechem is 15 and Dinah is 12? Does it make a difference?
What's a 12-year-old got? What business is a 12-year-old going? She probably didn't go by herself, but going to.
Good question. What did she leave her safe place
Yeah,
and
a
go into
12-year-old,
Shechem?
why would she do that? Why would she?
Curiosity about women of another culture or another land.
Yeah, it does insinuate that she went to see, she wanted to see what they were like, right? She got out of her nice safe cocoon and went out to see what the other women were like.
I think people probably did grow up quicker in those days.
They didn't live
Yeah.
as long,
Yeah.
so.
If you reached puberty, that meant you were ready to get married. Whatever age puberty hit, you were ready to get married, especially for girls. Guys were not ready to get married until they had a job and a house. You couldn't get married until you had your own house, place to live.
I never realized that this story shows the change in Jacob's influence.
Yeah.
That was interesting to
This
me.
is, we have one more, maybe two more lessons, but probably one more lesson, and then we're onto the Joseph cycle, because this is it for Jacob.
Right.
This is it. Okay, this is Genesis 34 and Genesis 35. He moves to Bethel, and that's really the last time we hear God speak to him. Well, God comforts him and tells him to go on to Egypt, but he's no longer the main character after chapter 35.
Just shows that God uses people that aren't very nice people sometimes in his plan. Because I have never really liked Jacob. You know, because he was so deceitful and because but he
Yeah.
was in God's plan.
Yeah.
For salvation.
And earlier in part 3 we talked about Esau, and it's very hard to like Esau, even
Oh.
though I tend to. But yeah, both of the twins were, you know, Esau was really rough, and the language, especially in the Hebrew, just treats him like an animal, basically. Yeah, like a big hairy animal. That's what he was. Okay, that just happened to be able to talk. But,
They were a couple of juvenile delinquents,
yep,
basically,
Yep.
at that point.
yeah. What did the people of the Hebrews hear at that time? Remember again, this is Moses or someone telling them the story while they're just left Egypt, while they've been wandering around. What are they hearing? What is it that they heard in this story?
I think it would have helped them to keep their ideas on their own group and keeping their own group together, not get friendly with each others.
Okay.
Of course, they probably didn't have a lot of wandering around in the desert. That probably wasn't a problem,
Right. Right.
because I don't imagine a lot of people lived there, but because God had to provide for them in a special way too.
Okay.
But I think you see that all through history. Even today, with the families and tribes, and going back into history, there's not very much of it indicated today, but what were your Bedouins? They were always on the move.
Yep.
Family cliques.
Family units. And they would have big, even today, but especially in the last 100 years, they would have big gatherings. Once a year they would all gather in one big place and get a little intermarrying going with, but yeah, the rest of the year they would just wander. But they know a little bit, the purpose of all of this storytelling that Moses is doing, all of this relating of who they are, It's to establish the identity of these people that didn't have an identity. All they were was slaves. Okay, that's all they knew they were. Okay, slaves who just happened to be Jews. Okay, or different, or Hebrews, different than the Egyptians. And now Moses and God is trying to give them, establish an identity for them. This is who you are. This is where you came from. Abraham, Isaac, now Jacob. And we're getting into Joseph. This is who you are. This is where you came from. And I gotta believe, as he's talking about the deceitfulness and the stubbornness of the sons, what was Moses dealing with, trying to get them out of Egypt, right? Just to get them to travel for a little while. I mean, they're complaining about food, about water. They're complaining about they don't have cucumbers like they had in Egypt, right? They're complaining about everything. But they want to keep going back because their identity was so tied to Egypt. I call it a codependency. Egypt depended on them as a slave labor, but they depended on Egypt. They didn't know anything different. It was just like people that have mental or emotional issues now that are codependent. Okay, you need each other, and to tear that apart in the desert is what Moses and God was trying to do. Tear out that dependency that they had. I got to go back to Egypt. I got to go back to my abusive husband. I got to do that, right? So he's trying to break that apart, and that's part of this identity and part of this story. So, all right, next week or next time, Genesis 35. What does Beth-El mean? You should all know that by now, right? What does Beth-El mean, Levita?
Something about God.
Something about God. Yep, El is God. What is Beth? House of God. Beth-El. Bethlehem. Right? A lot of those. When was Jacob last there? You can probably answer that one already. When was Jacob last in Bethel?
When he made an altar there.
Mm-hmm. And why did he make an altar there? You all know it. You just don't connect the two stories.
The angels going up
Yeah,
and down.
the ladder, the stairway to heaven, the pyramid, I would call it.
Pyramid, yeah.
But yeah, the ziggurat, the pyramid, the stairway, the ladder, the bridge. Right, that's that house of God. He called it the house of God, and it's fitting. That's when he left, and that's what he comes back to, and that's where he is until he goes back to Egypt, or goes to Egypt. Okay, and then God renews the covenant with Jacob. And what's the same and what's different? You'll have to kind of compare, because the covenants are the promises. I don't want to say the covenant changed. The promises within that covenant changed. It did it with Abraham. We showed that the intensity of the promises were much more, and then also the way that Abraham's role in that covenant changed. So God renews it with Jacob. Because he gave it to him the first time at Bethel, and he renews it again at Bethel. So, read 35, and then we have the story of the death of Isaac, and then and the genealogy, and we're done with the Jacob cycle. We start Joseph after that. I think that's the purpose of this passage. Why do you think this was put in Scripture, this weird passage? Why do you think it was put in there?
I was telling Court, with our background, we think it's because God wanted his people separate from the others, and this was to show what happens if you don't keep yourselves to yourself
Yeah.
and let yourself mix with other people who have other gods. But I told him, he'll probably have something way different, he'll probably mess with that.
Now, that and the failure to follow God's orders.
Yeah, yeah, we're gonna talk
When he
about
moved
that.
into that neighborhood and bought that piece of property, he was told to clean house. He didn't do it.
That's right. That's right.
Well, he wasn't told then to kill all the inhabitants, was he?
No,
No,
not yet.
not yet, no,
Now, that's a Moses time
Yeah.
frame,
yeah,
but picture this again is Moses telling the story, right?
that's right,
Mhm.
that's right.
So it always kind of changes things when you put it in the perspective of the children of Israel being the ones hearing this, or that this story is actually aimed at and targeted at. So it always changes the perspective. All right, let's get into it. I think we got a few people come on in, so I think we do. Anyway, more visitors. Maybe they won't. All right, but before we get started, I did cover that in the first part of actually the second part of Abraham. I never covered the part of circumcision. So we're going to do a little talk about circumcision this morning. Sorry, ahead of time. All right, because it does play a very important part in the Bible, and you have to understand what circumcision is and what it's all about in order to understand this passage and we're in a pretty obscure passage here, kind of. It's going to be interesting when we get done, whether you think, hopefully you will understand why this passage was put in here. But that's my question to start out with. Genesis 34, this is part 3, lesson 8 on Dinah. Remember the story of Dinah? The only daughter that we know for sure of Jacob. And it's just this obscure story. What's the big deal with her? What's she up to? What do you remember about that story?
It's a sordid thing.
Yep.
Yeah.
Kind of like Judah in many other passages as well. I mean, even into the New Testament, you hear a lot about circumcision and the battle between Paul and the Jews, whether they have to be circumcised or not. All of that is still important, even in the New Testament. So grab a piece of paper there and have a seat. Perfect timing. We're just getting into the text.
I think we're a little late, but we'll do it in mind.
That's okay.
Hi. Oops, these are.
A couple of them on wheels there, so. All right. Yeah, now I put the table in between us and you guys still sit further back all the time, so. All right. We are on page 78, so just flip the page once over and we're going to talk about circumcision. Good morning. It's a good topic for Sunday morning, don't you think? Page 78 there. The oldest documented evidence of circumcision was in ancient Egypt. The Tamar. It
Yeah.
seems like
Yeah,
out in the middle of nowhere it pops up, and
Mm-hmm.
so and here we have it too. Remember what Simeon and Levi did? They went in and killed them all. Yep. Why did they do it? Do you remember?
to avenge their sister.
To avenge their sister. To avenge Dinah. Yes. Okay. Where was Jacob in all of this?
He just wasn't there.
He wasn't, was he?
Those kids didn't tell him anything, did they?
He said a few words before, or it says that he waited for the sons to come home, right? And then later it just says that he kind of yelled at them for, now we're a stench in the nostrils of the people here.
Right.
So that's about all we hear from him. I think those are connected.